Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala khatamil anbiya wa sayyidil mursaleen wa ala alihi wa ashabihi al-ghurril mayameen wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin. Amma ba'd. A'udhu billahi as-sami'il alim minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wa ma arsalnaka illa rahmatan lil alameen. Respected brothers and sisters in Islam, I am back with another episode of Unveiling the Muslim Civilization, and today we are going through part 11. Today we will be talking about the impact of Muslim libraries on the Western civilization, the impact of Muslim intellectual activity that was taking place in places like, let's say, Al-Andalus, Spain, Baghdad, Damascus, Sicily, Central Asia. All of this region was vibrant. It was pregnant with ideas which were pioneered by the Muslim intellectuals and non-Muslim intellectuals who were also writing in the Arabic language. So the Arabic language had become the lingua franca of the civilized world. I want everyone to share this feed on the pages so that other people can join us, inshallah ta'ala. If you're watching, please share the feed so that other people can join us. And may Allah bless you all. Thank you so much for your comments and your questions and your praise. May Allah bless you. So Unveiling the Muslim Civilization is a series about the Muslim civilization and its achievement. A lot of people expect me to criticize the Muslim civilization. I'm not doing that. I am simply making episodes upon episodes to highlight the achievements of Islam and Muslim. Okay, there are plenty of academic works whereby you can read about all the negative history if you want to see negativity. I am going to talk about the positive achievements of Islam and Muslims. This is what I've been talking about for the past 10 episodes. Today is the 11th episode. I started with the early Islamic conquests and their impact on the lands that were taken by the Muslims in the early centuries of Islam, and then whatever happened afterwards, the outcome, the result, of that expansion which took place in the first century of Islam. Al-Andalus was one of the places where the Muslims came, and I talked about Al-Andalus extensively. I also talked about libraries in the Muslim world in general and in Al-Andalus, in Islamic Spain in particular, in medieval Spain. The history of medieval Spain, for some reason, is not even considered the history of Europe. Unfortunately, a lot of the Eurocentric authors who write history today, they don't even consider Al-Andalus or Islamic Spain to be part of Europe, which is very, very strange. Spain is indeed seen as part of Western Europe today, right? But 700 years of history of Spain is treated as alien history because it is Islamic for some reason. So we really need to revise that way of thinking. We need to review whether that thinking is accurate historically or is even just, right? If Spain is part of Western Europe, then the history of Spain during the Muslim period is also the history of Western Europe for nearly 700 years. So medieval Spain was essentially Islamic predominantly. Muslims governed Spain for nearly 700 years. Parts of Spain, sometimes most of Spain, sometimes parts of Spain. And while the Muslims are governing Spain, they brought about a magnificent civilization. We talked about it extensively. Those of you who are watching right now, please share this feed, this live feed on your pages so that other people can join us, inshallah ta'ala, and we can benefit from these sessions. So Al-Andalus, the history of Al-Andalus, the history of Islamic Spain is a huge topic. Politically speaking, there is a lot written on it. Few books I will strongly recommend to begin with, and they are as follows. Anwar Shahna has written the history of Muslim Spain. Then we have 2 volumes compilation on the legacy of Muslim Spain. The book is titled The Legacy of Muslim Spain. It has been edited by Salma Khadra Jayusi. Salma Khadra Jayusi it was published by Routledge publisher, or Routledge. I don't know how you would pronounce the term, Routledge or Routledge. Okay, it is published by Routledge publishers, and it is an absolutely fascinating collection of articles on Al-Andalus and the legacy of Muslim Spain. Then there are books like Ornament of the World, if you want to read an easy narrative. It is by Maria Rosa Manacol. Then there is a history of Islamic Spain and Portugal by Hugh Kennedy. You must look into that. Then there is a man called Richard Fletcher, who has written the history of Moorish Spain. And there are many more books I can advise you to read. There are specific topics people have published books on academically. But if you want to read a general history of Spain, a general introduction of the Muslim legacy in Spain, then I would strongly recommend the book of Anwar Shahna titled The Muslim Spain. Also, if you want to read an Orientalist work from the 19th century, then Reinhard Dozy has written a history of the Arabic Spain or Arab Spain, on the Muslim Spain. His book is very, very highly recommended, right? So these are some of the works I wanted to mention very quickly. Okay, so my brothers and sisters, I want to very quickly highlight some of the issues I want to address, which were picked on in the last episode. The legacy of Islam in Western Europe. How did the Muslims actually inspire the Western European civilization? I have strongly recommended one book in particular on this very topic, and that book is The Hidden Debt to the Islamic Civilization. The book is titled The Hidden Debt to the Islamic Civilization. You can find a lot of information there. So as you know, last week I talked about Muslim libraries in Spain. Okay, these libraries were accumulated, they were collected, or they were put together, they were established by Muslims predominantly, and then some Jewish and Christian scholars who were part of the establishment. When I say the establishment, I mean the educational establishment in Muslim Spain. Muslim Spain was governed by the Muslim law, the Sharia law, the rulers of Muslims, and they were governing by the laws of Islam. And these laws facilitated coexistence, right? There are many books actually written in particular on the coexistence which was facilitated by Islam and Muslims in Al-Andalus, right? That's another topic. We can address that topic at another time, another day. But I want to focus on how Muslims shifted knowledge to the rest of Western Europe, okay? So I talked about Muslim libraries in the previous episode. Many books were collected or brought to Al-Andalus by Muslim travelers, Muslim adventurers, Muslim kings and caliphs and sultans were deeply interested in collecting books. So when these books came, they were put in different Muslim centers of power, power hubs, Muslim power hubs in Al-Andalus. For example, Cordoba or Toledo, Talaytala, okay, and Seville, or Valencia, for example, or Granada. Later on in 1492, the city of Granada fell to the Catholic monarchs, and they burnt over 1 million books as a result. So my brothers and sisters, I wanted to talk about very quickly that impact the libraries created in Al-Andalus, okay, so, and beyond. Al-Andalus and beyond. Many scholars have talked about the transfer of Muslim knowledge or the Arabic knowledge collected by Muslim, Jewish and Christian scholars, all of them together. They collected this knowledge, they wrote commentaries. This was a very vibrant environment to learn in, and there were institutions, educational institutions established in these places. So these scholars, they accumulated libraries. These kings or these rulers, they accumulated libraries. So one particular city, one city in particular called Toledo fell to the Christians from the north when they started Reconquista. It's called Reconquista. In other words, reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Arabs, from the Muslims. So Christians from the north, the Catholics, they started to conquer the land back from the Muslims in Islamic Spain. And that started predominantly in the 11th century, in the mid 11th century onwards, 1050s, let's say 1050s. Okay, one of the major cities to fall in the hands of the Christians was Bobastro, that fell in the hands of the Christians from the north in 1060s. 1085 is the year when the city of Toledo fell into the hands of Christian monarchs coming from the north. Okay, and when the city of Toledo fell to the Christians, they came across the library in that city, the grand library of the city of Toledo. Okay, and there were many libraries there. So all these books, they completely blew away these Christians who came from the north. And Western Europe, according to conventional thought, historic thought, Western Europe at the time was going through dark ages. Okay, a lot of 19th century historians and even mid 20th century historians, they considered that period to be the dark age. Now that view is being challenged because there was a lot going on in Western Europe at the time, so we cannot be so reductionist and call it the dark age. Rather, there were things happening in Western Europe, but they were simply not recorded. And of course, there was a period of economic decline, cultural decline, and there were many issues in Western Europe at the time. But one of the things happening in Western Europe was in Al-Andalus, Spain. And as I highlighted earlier, that the history of Islamic Spain for some reason is not seen as the history of Western Europe for some reason. And it is very strange. Eurocentric historians, Eurocentric authors, or generally speaking Western authors, don't treat the history of Islamic Spain as the history of Western Europe, or at least it doesn't come across like that. Okay, that's one of the problems we need to highlight so that we can do something about it. Now, a lot was happening in Al-Andalus in Spain. So these books that were found in Toledo, they simply blew away the Christians, and the Christians immediately they made a connection between these books and the civilization the Muslims had created in Al-Andalus in Spain. Okay, the Christians knew that the reason why the Muslims or the Arabs are so civilized in Spain, they are so sophisticated in Spain, is because of these books. They are highly knowledgeable, they are very educated people, they are philosophers, intellectuals, thinkers, and for that reason they are very powerful. They are very advanced, right? So they knew that these books must be translated so that the Europeans can learn this knowledge. And that happened. There was a man called Gerard of Cremona who was appointed to translate a lot of these works in Toledo into Latin, from Arabic into Latin. So many of these manuscripts were put in front of Gerard of Cremona, and Gerard started to translate all these works. Gerard of Cremona was a huge teacher. He was a big teacher for many students, and he actually personally supervised many translations, important translations of works that were found in Western Europe later on for centuries. And the details can be found in the books of, for example, George Sarton. George Sarton has written a book titled An Introduction to the History of Science. This book was published in the early 20th century, and the book is in 5 volumes. It's a huge, giant compendium collecting the history of the Muslim legacy in Spain in particular, and the role of Gerard of Cremona in transmitting this knowledge to the rest of Western Europe was highlighted extensively in this work. Also, you can find details in the book I mentioned earlier, Hidden Debt to the Islamic Civilization. In that book, you can find a lot of interesting details to do with the translation movement. So this translation movement, okay, it really changed the situation in Western Europe as far as knowledge is concerned. So when these translations made from Arabic into Latin appeared in Germany, in Paris, in Britain, these translations started to change Western European outlook on knowledge, on education, on higher education, on research, on being civilized in general. Okay, so the Europeans who were inspired by Arabic knowledge coming from Spain and Sicily and beyond, like from the Middle East. They became strong proponents of the Arabic knowledge. Strong, very strong proponents of this knowledge. So many men traveled from Western Europe to Muslim lands to accumulate this knowledge, and they were instrumental in bringing this knowledge to Western Europe. So based upon this knowledge, a lot of universities were established in Western Europe at the time. Okay, the University of Naples, for example, in Italy, was established mostly upon Arabic works translated into Latin. And sometimes even Arabic was taught as a language in these universities. In Western Europe, brothers and sisters, this is the point you have to remember. In Western Europe. So, there were universities in Paris. There were schools of philosophy in Britain in the 12th century and in the 13th century. In fact, a lot of scholars talked about a 12th century Renaissance, whereby many European scholars, students, authors traveled to Al-Andalus, which was very close to Western Europe. Okay, it was itself Western Europe, but as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't seen as Western Europe at that time, and even later on, and even today, historians don't consider it as part of Western Europe when it was ruled by the Muslims for almost 700 years, which is very strange, right? So a lot of these scholars, students were traveling into Spain and they were taking knowledge. People like Robert of Ketton, okay, people like Adelard of Bath, people like Gerard of Cremona, as I mentioned earlier, okay, and there is a huge list, okay, even one of the popes, Pope Gerbert of Aurillac, Pope Sylvester II, Pope Sylvester II, who was Pope from 999 to 1003, he was the Pope for 4 years. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, he had traveled to the Muslim lands to learn from the Muslims. He learned the science of mathematics. He brought abacus, which was an instrument like calculator is used today. It was a simpler version of calculator. It was used for calculating. He brought this knowledge to Western Europeans, among many other things, of course. And he was none other than Pope Sylvester II. So people who were highly influential in Western Europe had been influenced by the Muslim, the Muslim civilization in Al-Andalus and Sicily and beyond. Later on, this knowledge kept circulating in Western European universities, whereby people even started to dress like Muslims. They started to wear gowns. They started to wear Muslim hats. So you see the graduation hat you see today in universities, it looks flat from the top. A lot of people think this tradition came from the Muslim lands like Spain, where when students, they graduated, they would put the Quran on their head and it looked like a flat surface on top of their hats. And this is why today when people graduate in Western universities in particular, they have this flat, shaped hat on top of their heads. And I even had to wear one of those when I graduated from SOAS, from School of Oriental and African Studies in London, right? So this tradition actually came from medieval Spain, according to some scholars. I don't know how authentic or how accurate that assertion is. So a lot of this knowledge came with influences to Western European lands, okay? Language came with this knowledge. A lot of Arabic language was transferred to Western Europe at the time, right? So for 2 to 3 centuries, Muslim knowledge, Arabic knowledge, pioneered by the Muslims, Muslim commentaries on Aristotle, Muslim commentaries on works of Galen, on medicine, Muslim commentaries on many other Greek authors were translated into Latin, and then these works are being studied in Western Europe for centuries, for 3 to 4 centuries to come. And later on, even during the Italian Renaissance in Florence and other places in Naples, for example, a lot of these works were studied by Italian authors. Many people assume that some of the Renaissance thinkers were directly inspired by the Muslim civilization from Al-Andalus, from Spain. A lot of the works studied in Latin at that time were actually translated during the medieval Spanish period, or the Muslim rule of Spain, right? So what I'm trying to say is that Muslims had influenced directly the making of the Western civilization, the identity of the Western civilization. Muslims or Islamic civilization in Spain and Sicily was directly responsible. It was instrumental in inspiring what took place in Western Europe for 3 to 4 centuries when it comes to education. Most learned works, most important works that were being studied in Western universities were basically translations of Arabic works from Spain and Sicily and the Middle East, right? And you see, if I was to give you details, this particular lecture, which is about 25 minutes long or maybe half an hour long, is simply not going to do justice. So why am I telling you all those things, brothers and sisters? All these things, why am I mentioning them? I'm mentioning them because I started to talk about the Muslim civilization and its positive contribution to making what humanity, for making humanity what it is today, right? Muslims played a huge role, a positive role, okay, in forming language, culture, education, dress code, political systems, even as late as the 18th century. As late as the 18th century, as late as the 16th century or 17th century, European philosophers and thinkers were studying some of the Muslim works. Okay, it is thought that people like John Locke, as late as the 17th century, were directly inspired by the lectures of Edward Pocock, who was the lecturer in Islamic studies at the University of Oxford, right? So when Edward Pocock, who was an Orientalist, in fact, he was called the first Orientalist, he was a scholar in the 17th century at the University of Oxford, he would deliver lectures on the Muslim civilization, okay? And John Locke, the author of 3 treatises on tolerance and one of the founders of modern democratic principles, was an attendee in these lectures. So John Locke was directly inspired by the works of Edward Pocock, his lectures. And many people, they think that John Locke's theory on governance or government actually is inspired by the Khilafah system of Islam. He basically believed that rulership is a trust in the hands of a ruler. It is not a divine right, like Hobbes, another philosopher, argued. Thomas Hobbes, he argued that ruling is a divine right of the ruler in Europe, talking about European context. Locke, on the other hand, came up with a new theory on government. He believed that government is a trust in the hands of the ruler, a trust from God, so he has to do well by it. And this is the Islamic rule. This is an Islamic opinion. We have that the concept of rulership in Islam is a trust. You have to treat it like a trust. You cannot abuse the trust of God in your hands. So these are some of the interesting ideas I wanted to share with you very quickly. My time for today's lecture is up. So to summarize very quickly, my brothers and sisters, I talked about Muslim libraries and how they inspired a revolution of education in Western Europe. Western European institutions took knowledge directly from the Muslim lands, and of whatever was studied in terms of science, philosophy, and other fields in Western Europe came predominantly, pretty much a lot of it, if not all of it, a lot of it came from the Muslim lands, and Muslims were directly responsible for triggering or instigating or even creating what we know today as the Western civilization. I'm not saying Western civilization is a product of Islam. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is Western civilization, as it stands today, took a lot of its inspiration from the lands of Islam. Lands governed by the laws of Islam, lands like Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, lands like Sicily, lands like the Middle East, okay? And details can be found in the books I mentioned. The purpose of these talks and lectures is to simply highlight some of these facts, and you can go and do your research into these topics, inshallah ta'ala. And one day, inshallah, what I will do is I will do a session specifically on book recommendations, inshallah. So the entire session on Unveiling the Muslim Civilization series will be on, basically I will be talking about the books people can study to understand the legacy of the Muslim civilization in the world. Okay, so the whole session will be about book recommendations. And until next week, I seek your permission to leave. Thank you so much for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.